With me now from the Heritage Foundation, Hans von Spakovsky. Hans, good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Sure, thanks for having me.
All right, first of all, Hans, respond to Stacey Abrams. She is growing on the national stage. She is thought to be at least a front runner in contention for Vice President Joe Biden's vice presidential running mate. She says voter fraud is largely a myth. Is that true?
No, it's not. And, you know, she's from Georgia. She's obviously not very familiar with Georgia history. There's been all kinds of cases of voter fraud in Georgia, including, by the way, a prosecution in Dodge County, Georgia in the 1990s that involved fraudulent absentee ballots, among other kinds of fraud.
Okay, so talk to me about the agenda of the Democrats, because it's hard for many people, including myself, to sit here and say, well, Democrats want mail-in voting, universal mail-in voting, because they want voter fraud, because that helps them. Yet, when you use Occam's razor and you eliminate every other possibility of why they could want it, you're left with, well, they seem to want that to happen, want some fraudulent activity to happen because it does benefit them.
Well, yeah, the reason we know that, and the reason you're correct is this. Look, in every single state, they already have rules governing absentee or mail-in ballots. And yet Democrats in Congress, for example, have pushed all these bills to change or put in federal mandates when it comes to mail-in ballots that would get rid of the security protocols that are in place to try to prevent that kind of fraud. So why are they doing that? Because they want to make it easier to cheat using absentee ballots.
Okay, so talk to me about those securities, because, by the way, mail-in voting is necessary for people who are serving our country in the military overseas, right, for people who are ill, for people who can't otherwise leave their homes, for the elderly. There are a lot of valid reasons for absentee and mail-in voting. Talk to me about the securities specifically that Democrats want to eliminate.
Well, for example, one of the bills in the Senate would tell local officials that they have to accept absentee ballots, not just those that are postmarked by the end of Election Day, when you have an official postmark indicating that the voter actually did vote before the polls closed, but they would have to accept any ballots with a signature where the voter claims that they signed the ballot before the end of Election Day. Well, there's no way in the world for folks to be able to confirm that. Another provision in Nancy Pelosi's bill would have gotten rid of all voter ID requirements in the states. That, again, is a real problem because there's no way to check or verify the identity of the voters. There's just a long whole series of provisions like that that would basically completely open up absentee ballots and mail-in ballots without any ability of election officials to authenticate them, check their validity, or otherwise prevent fraud.
Right. And there is evidence, despite what DNC Chair Perez and Stacey Abrams says. We have evidence of this. And it's not one of those things. This is what makes me crazy about the Democrats' narrative about voter fraud is we don't want to wait until an election has been completely corrupted before we address voter fraud. We want to identify vulnerabilities to protect every person's vote against it so that it doesn't happen. You don't have to wait for the crime to be committed before you do something to try to mitigate it. And that's what's crazy to me about the Democrats' narrative. Hans, also address for me this idea that the Democrats seem to be moving towards, they seem to want to have more federal control over elections, even though that's not how elections are set up in our Constitution.
No, in fact, that's what happened with Nancy Pelosi's bill that she tried to push through to deal with the coronavirus. In essence, they took all these provisions that had been in H.R. 1. That was the first bill they put in that would have basically had the federal government taking over elections. They've basically taken all of those provisions and put them into these coronavirus bills. They want the federal government controlling elections all over the country. And of course, our founders didn't want that. They thought it was a bad idea to allow incumbents who are in Washington to set the rules for elections because then they might be able to manipulate the rules to make sure they stay in office.
Well, I think our founders were onto something. They seem to
and they work.
They seem to show remarkable insight about how our government would run in this day and age. So to sum up, Democrats have long wanted universal mail-in voting, not just in and of itself,
right,
but without the securities to ensure that people's votes are protected, that the integrity of our elections remains intact. They've long wanted this agenda. It hasn't ever been something they've been able to pass on its merits. So they have to use scare tactics, fear-mongering, telling
right,
people that they might get COVID-19. They used a story from Wisconsin about 19 people contracting COVID-19 from the polls, but a recent study, this most recent study, shows that there was no detectable surge in transmission of COVID-19 based on these Wisconsin elections. So don't let Democrats fool you. Don't let them use this narrative to convince you to put into place something that they want, mail-in voting, universal mail-in voting, they wanted anyway. It's a trick. Hans, thank you for covering this. I appreciate it.